Hi, I'm Bryan Jensen. I'm with UW Extension's Integrated Pest Management Program and would like to take a few minutes to talk about insect pests of soybeans. If you're looking for current management recommendations, insecticides, things like that, I would ask that you go to our learning store and look at our publication, Pest Management in Wisconsin Field Crops. You can do a search for its number, A3646, and it'll be your top choice. The soybean insects we'll talk about are seed corn maggots, several types of defoliators, bean leaf beetle, two-spotted spider mites, and we'll finish up with soybean aphids. First, seed corn maggot. They have a very wide host range. Several garden vegetables can be damaged by seed corn maggots. In the field crop area, however, both corn and soybeans can have damage, but alfalfa or small grains should not have any damage from seed corn maggot. And between soybeans and corn, soybeans are much more susceptible to seed corn maggot than what corn is. The adult is a fly, and they do not damage corn or soybeans. The larvae are small, kind of whitish color, and they're cigar-shaped. All the feeding from seed corn maggot is below ground, and they will feed on the seed, causing it not to germinate and or emerge. And they can also feed on the hypocotyl and also on the cotyledons as well. We have several generations per year, but it's usually those first 2 or 3 generations that will give us our most damage in field crops. And those population peaks are at 360, 1080, and 1800 degree days, and that's base 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Seed corn maggot will have increased damage potential when we are applying livestock manure to our corn, and also green manure as well. Those two types of, quote, manure can be very attractive and bring in a lot of adults to lay eggs. Also, anytime you till a field, sometimes as you're coming back after that first pass, for whatever reason, that freshly tilled field can be very attractive to the adults, and you can start to see the adult fly flying around about a foot or 2 above the ground. And anytime you have weather that's cool or wet soil conditions, anytime you have those type of conditions that delays emergence, that seed and that cotyledons are exposed to damage from seed corn maggot for a longer period of time. Our symptoms will be poor emergence. We'll have skips in the field. With soybeans, we can have a snakehead, and to describe that, that's the hypocotyl has emerged through the soil, but has been cut off. The cotyledons have been cut off from the cotyledon, and you just have the hypocotyl with kind of a shepherd's crook to it, and with that there will be no growing point on that plant, and that plant is essentially dead. They may feed on the cotyledons. They may scar it, and in which case, if they don't get to the growing point, that's not of economic concern, or they at times can consume the whole cotyledon. And finally, you can have holes in the unifoliate leaves, but that's primarily cosmetic in nature. Here's a picture of seed corn maggots that have been feeding on the cotyledons. Another picture of what we often call snakehead, and that the maggot has been feeding below ground level on the hypocotyl, and when it emerged through the soil, it broke off because of that feeding. We can get some scarring of the hypocotyl, but this plant is likely going to recover because we have a growing point right here that is that can take over on this individual plant. They have broken the hypocotyl and it's not going to survive. And here's a picture of a soybean field with a very long row of beans that has not emerged. And it's going to be important from a management standpoint to find out why. Is it because the drill or planter was not working, or is it because of other pests, whether it's diseases or insects? In this case, we're talking about soybean maggot, and they can cause that skips in the row. I'd mentioned they can cause holes in the unifoliate. That is, for the most part, not to be concerned about because that plant is up and out of the ground. All the seed corn maggot feeding is below ground, and that plant's going to survive without any economic loss. At least that individual plant will. There are several soybean defoliators that we can run into in the course of a growing season. That can include grasshoppers, especially in dry years, or the year after a dry year, Japanese beetles, green clover worms, woolly bear caterpillars, several different species, thistle caterpillars, which is the immature stage of the painted lady butterfly, and also western corn rootworms can feed on soybean leaves as well. Those defoliators can have a range of symptoms, from irregular holes in the leaf to what I call lacing. Again, those are holes in the leaf, but the smaller leaf veins remain intact. And I have a picture to show you of that in just a little bit. Or they can be feeding on the leaf margins and in. The economic threshold has been developed. It's two-part. Two-part because of soybean growth stage. On the vegetative stage, it's between 30 to 40% defoliation. And once we get into those R, or reproductive stages, that plant is much more susceptible, and the economic threshold is reduced significantly to about 15 to 20% defoliation. But it's important that you assess the damage over the entire plant, not just on the upper leaves. Here's a field shot of what some of that damage can look like. It looks worse than what it is. I do have to remind you that you have to assess the percent defoliation on the entire canopy, not just on those upper leaves. Here's a green clover worm. To identify it, is kind of a green translucent body with a green head and a white stripe down its side. This is the thistle caterpillar, kind of a darker caterpillar with a lot of very apparent spines. Again, that's the immature stage of the painted lady butterfly. We have several different species of woolly bear caterpillars, the brown ones, the yellow ones, and also the brown and black banded ones. Japanese beetles have been able to overwinter better in the state, starting with the early 2000s. And this is a good picture of what that lacing can look like. Generally smaller holes, at least initially, and you can get some of those smaller leaf veins remaining intact. And again, to identify them, they're a very metallic looking beetle. The thorax area will be a very bright shiny green. The wing covers will be a shiny bronze, and they will have 6 tufts of white hair along each side of the abdomen. And finally, numerous species of grasshoppers can feed on soybeans, but they tend to be more of a problem in dry years or the year after a drought year. Here's a picture of a leaf of soybeans, and your task, as I mentioned earlier, would be to identify percent defoliation on the entire plant, not on just a few leaves. The next insect we'll talk about is the bean leaf beetle. They overwinter as adults, and mild winters favor their survival. The earliest planted soybean fields are going to be the most attractive because the adults are somewhat mobile, and they will move small distances to those newly emerging plants. And we'll have 2 generations of bean leaf beetles per year. The adults are what damage soybeans. They are similar in size and shape to corn rootworm adults. That is, they're about 1/4 of an inch long or a little bit less. They have various patterns and arrangements of black geometric shapes on their wing covers. They may have a couple black lines along the side. They may have 6 black dots. They may have 2. They may have 4. Their base color will be pale yellow. It can be kind of a greenish color or crimson in color, but they will always have a black triangle right behind the thorax. The larvae will feed on soybean root nodules and hairs, and they are not considered an economic concern. Here's a close-up of an adult bean leaf beetle, and that's what we have to remember. All bean leaf beetles will have that black triangle right behind the thorax. They may be yellow, they may be greenish, they may be crimson in color. They may or may not have these stripes along the side of the wing covers, and they may or may not have any of these black dots. There may be 6 of them, there may be 4, and there may be 2. The adults damage soybeans by chewing holes in the leaf. They may chew on the peduncle, which is the structure that attaches the bean pod to the plant. They can also chew on the bean within the pod, and that can cause some secondary infections, and they also transmit bean pod mottle virus. There's a threshold that's published in the Pest Management in Wisconsin Field Crop Circular. So look at A3646. Here's an example of what that economic threshold looks like at the V1 stage of development. We'll have our choice within this matrix of a crop value that's 10 or 12, and the table within A3646 is expanded beyond these crop values. And also we will have to look at our cost of treatments. And then our threshold is based on where where the column and the line intersect. For example, if our treatment costs are $6 per acre and our crop value is $10 per bushel, then we should spray at about 1.8 beetles per plant. 2 spotted spider mites are what I would classify as an occasional pest in Wisconsin, but when they are present primarily during hot, dry spells, they can be an extremely important pest. The adults are kind of greenish yellow in color, very, very small, 0.3 to 0.4 millimeters long. All adults will have 8 legs, and they have 2 blackish colored spots on each side of the body. And when populations are extremely high, they can produce some webbing. The nymphs are smaller in size, and they may either have 6 or 8 legs based on their development. They damage soybean plants, or they can damage corn, but soybeans are much more susceptible by using their stylet-like mouthparts, and then they extract plant sap. So it's important to remember that they're a pest of hot, dry weather. During most normal growing seasons, we don't have to worry about them. But if you get in a period of hot, dry weather, that's about 2 to 3 weeks long, I would go out and spot check for their damage. The eggs will hatch in 2 to 4 days. The nymphs will also develop in about 2 to 4 days, and the adults live for upwards of 21 days. Early detection is going to be critical. If we're going to manage 2 spotted spider mites, we need to manage them to control them when they are first getting started. So start spot checking after a couple weeks of dry weather. Usually populations will get started on field edges. You can use a white sheet of paper, hold that underneath the leaf, tap a leaf, and look for little specks or spots to run away. Those are typically going to be spider mites, but use a hand lens for verification. Remember, they will be small, but the adults will have 2 black spots on their back. Also, at the same time, inspect the leaves for signs of stipuling, and those are going to be small, whitish or pale yellow dots on the leaves. Our treatment threshold is when 15% of the leaf area is discolored or stipuled during the early reproductive stages of soybeans. You also want to make sure that you have live mites present and that hot, dry weather is expected. If you need to spray, make sure you inspect those fields soon after the re-entry interval has expired. You want to make sure that you control that population. Continue to scout for 2-spotted spider mites as long as you have drought conditions. Don't assume that one application during the drought will control them completely. There are other factors that will help control 2-spotted spider mites other than just weather. There's a fungal pathogen that will help control it, but it's going to be most common when temperatures are less than 85 degrees Fahrenheit. You have 90% humidity or above. It will take an infection period of 12 to 24 hours. And those infected mites are going to be kind of a darker or waxy in color, and death is going to be within 1 to 3 days. And the purpose of pointing that out is, as you're scouting, if you get a treatable population, but you're starting to see a fair number of mites with the fungal pathogen, then I may consider not spraying. Certainly coming back to that field within a few days, especially if drought conditions continue, just to recheck to see what might be happening. Here's a close-up of the adult mites. There's a couple there, some immature mites, and also the eggs. When you're scouting or rechecking that field after an application, do look for the eggs. The eggs are a sign that population has a potential to increase. Our insecticides, if we did spray them, do not control the eggs. So that's the main purpose for coming back and rechecking after that REI is up. Here's a soybean leaflet with very early indication of 2-spotted spider mite feeding. We can see just the start of some of that leaf stipuling getting started. And that's the point where we want to catch the spider mite population. If it gets to this point, that spider mite population has caused significant damage, and certainly if we start to see some bronzing of the leaf, we have lost a fair amount of yield at that point in time. And one of the other damage symptoms of 2-spotted spider mites is that once we start to get that entire part of that leaf is turning yellow, if not bronzing, those leaves can drop off. This shot was taken during a drought year, and it was mid-July. Finally, would like to finish up with soybean aphids. They are an introduced pest in North America, first found in North America in 2000, right around the area of Milton and Janesville, Wisconsin. They are a small, soft-bodied insect. Both the immatures and the adults can be kind of a yellowish-green in color or more of a cream-colored if they're one of these white dwarfs. And we'll talk about them in just a little bit. The adults can be winged or unwinged. Here's a picture of what a winged soybean aphid can look like. and their head can be black as well as their thorax. The underwing are that cream colored and if they're a white dwarf, or yellowish green color. They are an insect with piercing, sucking mouthparts, and their damage symptoms can run the gamut from stunting to reduced pod count, smaller seed size, honeydew accumulating on the leaf and following up with sooty mold, and they can also transmit soybean viruses. Soybean aphids overwinter on buckthorn. At that point in time, there'll be 2 to 3 generations per year before they migrate to soybeans. They typically will migrate to soybeans that might be mid to late June. We have seen populations get started on soybeans in Wisconsin even right around Memorial Day. They'll go through, maybe 15 to 18 generations on soybeans, and then they'll migrate back to buckthorn, where they will go through sexual reproduction and lay eggs. And it is only the egg stage that can overwinter in Wisconsin. During the summer months, when they're feeding on soybeans, only females are going to be present. They go through asexual reproduction. There is no mating. There is no egg stage. And each generation may be winged or unwinged. They have a very high reproductive capacity. In a lab, they can double in population in as little as 3 days. If our environmental conditions are favorable and we don't have a lot of beneficial insects out there, they can reproduce. They can double in population in as little as maybe a week or so. But 70 to 80 degrees are optimal for survival and reproduction, and the nymphs can mature in as little as 5 to 6 days. So on a particular leaf, you can have a grandmother giving live birth to females, you can have a mother giving live birth to females, and you can have the granddaughters giving birth to live females. We had mentioned the white dwarfs. They are smaller and they're cream colored, and it's important to note them if you're finding them as you're scouting. They're usually found later in summer and on lower leaves. And the important part of the white dwarfs is that they are shorter lived and they have a lower reproductive potential than the yellow-green aphids. To scout, start spot checking in June, and that's just, I think it's important to get an early indication of if mites are there and if populations are increasing, because if we're going to control soybean aphids, it will be important to know if that population is increasing, decreasing, or plateauing. To scout for the aphids, check 20 to 30 plants per field and count the aphids on the entire plant. Record the crop stage, that's going to be important. And then also estimate the number of beneficial insects, whether it's the multicolored lady beetles or other pathogens. That can affect whether or not we are going to treat for soybean aphids. The threshold for aphids, if you're at a growth stage of R1 through R4, it's about 250 per plant, but it's also really important to know, is that population increasing, is it stagnant or plateauing, or is it decreasing? Especially if your population is plateauing or decreasing, you'll probably not get a response to spraying at 250 per plant. However, if your numbers are increasing over time and you're at R1 to R4 with 250 per plant, you can expect that population to increase, and there you would get an economic response to spraying. Once we get to that R5 growth stage, the threshold is not clearly understood. Likely that threshold will be above 250 aphids per plant. And we'll end here with, I think, what's a pretty good picture of what can happen to soybean aphids with their population. We have a multicolored Asian lady beetle, which can be a really good predator in both the adult stage or immature stage. The immature stage looks like a small caterpillar, mostly black, very mobile, with some pink or orange dots on its back. We have the typical greenish yellow soybean aphid. We have a couple adult winged aphids. We also have some of the white dwarfs on that plant. And also we have some cast skins. For the immature stages of insects, especially soybeans, for them to mature, they have to cast or get rid of their exoskeleton. And these cast skins are not a sign of a decrease in population, but they're a sign of a increasing population. So with that, that'll conclude our little talk on soybean pests. Thank you.